Hello, welcome to the fifth webinar of our series, Welfare Webinar Wednesdays. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, perhaps from the US, because we've actually made it a reasonable time for you to join this time around, we've launched this series of webinars as a result of the Animal Welfare Forum being cancelled earlier in the year due to the COVID pandemic. But we just had such a wealth of amazing presenters, such interesting welfare topics that we wanted to be able to disseminate some of that welfare information to those who are interested. So that's what launched this series today, and we're just so glad you could all join us. So I think without further ado, I'll just give you a brief introduction to Lance. So Lance began his career in the zoo world at Disney's Animal Kingdom, where he worked for over 5 years, first in the education department and then in the research department. In his role, he worked on various ex situ and in situ research biology projects, such as one where he looked at nesting patterns in sea turtles on the Florida coast. He then went on to complete his master's and a PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Southern Mississippi, and then went on to work as a scientist for the Zoological Society of San Diego, which led him to his current role as Vice President of Conservation Science and Animal Welfare Research at the Chicago Zoological Society, where he's worked for over 6 years now. He's currently a member of the EAZA Research and Technology Committee. He's chair of the EAZA Animal Welfare Committee, and he's a steering committee member of the EAZA Behavioural Scientific Advisory Group. So as you can tell, he has a great experience and great experience on a variety of research topics such as enrichment, behavioural ecology and welfare, and he's bringing with him a wealth of knowledge about a variety of different taxa as well. So we are so incredibly grateful that he's joining us today and offering his time and expertise to share and discuss such an interesting topic of behavioural diversity as a positive welfare indicator. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Lance so he can get stuck right into the presentation. But again, from everyone here, from everyone watching the recording, thank you so much, Lance, for joining us today. And I'm really looking forward to this webinar topic. So we'll see if we can get Lance up now.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you to EAZA for the opportunity to present today. And thank you for those of you that have logged in and joined for the presentation. Really excited to be talking about something that I've really focused on quite a bit over a number of years, and that is behavioral diversity as a potential positive indicator of animal welfare. So for today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the opportunities to thrive. Many of you are probably familiar with the 5 domains model for animal welfare, and this is something a little bit different that I just want to touch on briefly that kind of guides into the theory behind behavioral diversity. I'm going to talk a little bit about some previous research that supports the idea that behavioral diversity is a positive indicator of animal welfare. At that point, I'll take a brief break, allow for some potential questions. Hopefully there'll be a lot of great discussion today. And then following the break, I will talk a little bit about some of the current efforts to validate behavioral diversity as an indicator of welfare. Talk about how you can apply behavioral diversity within a zoo or an aquarium. And then talk about future directions in terms of kind of what's needed to further validate behavioral diversity as a potential indicator of animal welfare. And then end with another question and answer session. So historically, historically, the field of animal welfare has focused on negative indicators of welfare, such as stereotypic behavior, stress, different things like that. And this is really evidenced on the 5 freedoms, which have been covered in previous talks on this forum, with 4 of the 5 being very negative in focus. However, lack of negative indicators of welfare doesn't necessarily equate to an animal having positive state of welfare. And we really do need to validate positive indicators of animal welfare to really continue to move the field forward. I'm a little biased, obviously I work in a zoo, but I think most animals in zoos and aquariums are doing really well. And in order to demonstrate that, I think it's really important that we have positive indicators of animal welfare to not only show that they're doing well, but also to determine what factors lead to positive welfare. So I said most of you are probably familiar with the 5 domains model. This is something a little bit different that we developed at the San Diego Zoo. Greg Vicino and I back in 2013. It was first presented in 2015. And really it was a framework that we wanted to create to take our welfare program to the next level. So animal care and welfare at the San Diego Zoo, really driving it forward. And so the opportunities to thrive were developed as a way to kind of view the animal welfare of the collection. So the opportunities are an opportunity for a well-balanced diet, opportunity to self-maintain, opportunity for optimal health, opportunity to express species-specific behavior, and an opportunity for choice and control. And you can, as you can probably see, there's quite a bit of overlap with the 5 domain model. And this was developed with the idea that we would use outputs or outcomes to monitor each of these opportunities. And for the purpose of this talk, I'll be focusing just on the opportunity to express species-specific behavior. Going into it a little bit further, species-specific behavior, we wanted to provide quality spaces and appropriate social groupings that will be provided that encourage species-specific behaviors at natural frequencies and of appropriate diversity while meeting social and developmental needs of each species in the collection. And really, for the purpose of behavioral diversity, it's focusing on encourage species-specific behaviors at natural frequencies and of appropriate diversity. The goal was then to use behavioral diversity as one of the outcome measures or outputs to measure that we were providing this opportunity. And if meeting this opportunity, then animals would have high behavioral diversity. So the theory behind behavioral diversity is that if behavioral diversity is high, we're likely meeting the behavioral needs of animals under our professional care. If behavioral diversity is low, it potentially means that animals are either being lethargic or stereotyped in behavior, stereotypic behavior, both which can be signs of compromised welfare. And so the idea is that if behavioral diversity is high, the animals are hopefully in a positive state. The first area of research that supports the idea of behavioral diversity as a positive indicator of welfare comes from studies on behavioral restriction. The idea is that if an animal has behavior that is being restricted by its current environment, this could potentially lead to compromised welfare. And if the animal's welfare is compromised, it could lead to frustration, which could then lead to stereotypic behavior. And this has been shown in a variety of species. I'm just showing a couple of examples here. For pigs, they have an internal motivation to build nests, horses and foraging, mice burrowing, mink and swimming. Again, if these behaviors are restricted based on their current environment, that can lead to frustration, which is then displaced in the form of stereotypic behavior. I'm going to use an example with mink. Georgia Mason and colleagues did a really amazing study back in 2000, or published back in 2001, where they looked at how much effort mink would spend to get access to different resources. They had 7 different compartments. The doors were weighted with different weights at different levels, and they looked at how much effort they would be willing to expend to get to these different resources. And the resources are listed in the order of their preferred motivation. So out of all the things that they were given access to, the pool was the most important. But what was interesting was that they didn't spend a lot of time in the pool. It was just a quick swim. So looking at activity budgets by themselves might not really give you an idea of the motivation behind an animal's interest in what they're motivated to do or the behaviors that are meaningful to them. What was also interesting is that an empty cage, which is just an ability to have more room, was the least important to the mink. The second part of this study, which provides further evidence, looked at what happens when you provide visual access to these different resources but no physical access? In the first example, they were given visual access to food but without physical access. This resulted in a 50% increase in cortisol levels, which was significant compared to baseline. Providing visual access to a pool without physical access increased cortisol by 33%, which was also statistically significant. However, when you compared the increase in cortisol between food and access to, or visual access to the pool, there was no significant difference. So something as important as food or the physical ability to live was just as important or just as stressful to not have access to as having a quick swim in a pool. An empty cage and an alternative nest site, visual access but no physical access, had no significant difference compared to baseline in terms of their cortisol levels. So the idea is that not that by measuring behavioral diversity that we're guaranteeing we're meeting the behavioral needs of animals and guaranteeing that we're providing opportunities for them to engage in those behaviors that they're motivated to perform. But every additional behavior that an animal's engaged in is one less likely behavior that they might be motivated to perform and likely meeting their behavioral needs. So the idea is that by looking at behavioral diversity, hopefully we're looking at the opportunity for animals to meet their behavioral needs. The second area of research that supports behavioral diversity as a positive indicator of welfare is the relationship between behavioral diversity and stereotypic behavior. There's been a lot of studies that have anecdotally looked at when you provide something or when you do something that's enriching for the animals, you see an increase in behavioral diversity and a decrease in stereotypic behavior. There's a couple of species listed on the screen there: pigs, rabbits, leopard cats, songbirds, that have seen similar type things in those studies. There's very few studies that have actually looked at the statistical relationship between behavioral diversity and stereotypic behavior. A couple have found a significant inverse relationship that shows when behavioral diversity is high, stereotypic behavior is low. But to point out that there is contradicting evidence is there was a study done on Asiatic black and Malayan sun bears back in 2004 that found no statistical relationship. So the evidence isn't perfect, but the vast majority of studies that are out there do show, or anecdotally show, that behavioral diversity and stereotypic behavior, there is an inverse relationship, that when behavioral diversity is high, meaning that we're likely meeting the behavioral needs of the animals, that stereotypic behavior is low. The third area that supports behavioral diversity is the relationship between behavioral diversity and when we provide things to animals that we would think of as something that's positive for their management. Two examples, a study done by David Shepherdson looked at providing live fish for fishing cats and saw an increase in behavioral diversity as a result. Even following the presentation of live fish, those impacts lasted for days. And then also with giant pandas, a study done by Ron Swisegood showed that providing environmental enrichment, 5 different types, resulted in higher behavioral diversity for that species. So I'm really excited. There seemed to be a growing interest in behavioral diversity and incorporating it into welfare assessments. This is just one example. There's been multiple, but Sally Sherwin, who did a presentation earlier in the forum, one of her publications talking about welfare assessments talks about how good animal-based welfare level might be, displays high levels of behavioral diversity as expected for the species. So it's becoming more and more common, but we really need to think about, is it really an indicator of positive welfare? And if so, how do we measure it? And what specifically should we be looking at? So when calculating behavioral diversity or examining behavioral diversity, there's a couple of different things that you can look at. There's richness, which is the number of behaviors. And actually, let me back up a second. All of this, if you're unaware, is based on the field of ecology. And so when you're talking about diversity, it's typically diversity of species within an environment, but it can be adapted to looking at behavior. And so richness, as I was saying, would be the number of different behaviors that you observe. Evenness is the distribution of time across behaviors. So getting back to the idea of an activity budget, what percentage of time does an animal spend locomoting versus playing versus feeding or whatever it might be? And so taking these two things into account, there are two diversity index that have been used quite frequently, one more than the other. And these are the Simpson's Diversity Index and the Shannon's Diversity Index. Simpson's Diversity Index is most appropriate based on previous research when the distribution of behavior or species in this case is even, meaning you would want to use the Simpson Diversity Index if the animal spends approximately the same amount of time engaged in locomotion, feeding, playing, whatever those different behaviors are that you're looking at. However, as all of you are probably aware, that doesn't seem to be how animals typically behave. I wouldn't expect an animal to spend the same amount of time playing as eating, depending on the species. And that's why the Shannon's Diversity Index probably is most appropriate when looking at behavioral diversity. What it allows is to look at how some of those behaviors, taking mink as an example before, they don't spend a lot of time swimming, but it's something that's important to them. And so what the Shannon's Diversity Index does is it allows you to look at how those behaviors that don't happen at such a high frequency, how that impacts behavioral diversity. When you have something like feeding, if you were looking at gorillas, they spend a lot of time foraging. When you have a dominant behavior, the Shannon's Diversity Index is going to be best. And so that's why when we're looking at animal behavior and we're trying to look at behavioral diversity, the Shannon's Diversity Index is probably what would be best moving forward. However, we do need more research to better understand the index and how the exclusion of different variable or different behaviors impacts that index. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that towards the end of the talk. I did put up the calculation here. I'm not going to dive into it during the presentation, but if you have questions about it, please feel free to email me. There's also tons of articles out there that'll walk you through how to calculate the Shannon's Diversity Index using different software programs. So there's lots of information out there and would encourage you to dive in if you were interested. The one thing I do want to note, and this is something that we've been looking at quite a bit, and I'll talk again a little bit about this more later, is that we really need to think about what we include and exclude when we're calculating behavioral diversity. Obviously, we want to include species-specific behaviors. So based on the natural history of a species, looking at that diversity of behaviors, what might they be motivated to perform? And to make sure that behavioral diversity is a positive indicator of welfare, we want to exclude things that might artificially inflate the index, such as stereotypic or abnormal behavior. And then I have also been removing things like inactive and rest from calculations. While inactivity or resting is a species-specific behavior, and some species like lions or big cats spend a large part of the day resting. Resting can also be a sign of lethargy or lethargic behavior. And so by removing that behavior from the calculation, I'm hoping that that removes that, which gets back to the theory that if, again, behavioral diversity is high, we're meeting the behavioral needs of the animals. If it's low, it probably means that animals are either stereotyping or lethargic. Both could be signs of compromised welfare.
Okay, so we're already at the first question time, people. I'll give you a second to digest perhaps that calculation. Does anyone have any questions so far? Or shall we launch into the second part of the presentation? Okay, I think we'll just carry on and leave most of the discussion to the end of the session. Back to you, Lance.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right. So the second half of the talk, I'm going to be talking about some of the current efforts that we've been doing to try to validate behavioral diversity as a positive indicator of welfare. But before I dive into those studies, I want to give a little bit of background. While most are probably familiar with cortisol and glucocorticoids, there's some other physiological measures that people might not be as familiar with, and just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the research and why we've been looking at them. So glucocorticoids, cortisol, it's a marker of adrenal activity. Prolonged or exaggerated responses may negatively affect the immune system and thyroid function. The second one, aldosterone, it's an indicator of kidney function, promotes sodium retention and potassium excretion by the kidneys, also a marker of adrenal activity. And the final one, which is becoming more popular in recent years, but historically hasn't been used as an indicator of welfare, is DHEA. And low levels, or more specifically, an elevated cortisol to DHEA ratio, may be indicate a physiological imbalance due to adrenal fatigue, depression, or disease. And in the animal welfare field, DHEA has been rarely used, but there's quite a bit of research on humans looking at depression, disease, and how that cortisol to DHEA ratio may be an indicator of chronic stress. So a review article back in 2010 looked at this idea of cortisol to DHEA ratio. And the idea is that if an animal is chronically stressed, their cortisol levels might actually be lower than if they were in a normal, good, positive state. And that would be due to adrenal fatigue. However, if you look at the ratio of cortisol to DHEA, a elevated ratio will be present even if an animal is in adrenal fatigue. And so if you look at the graph that I've presented from this article, when an animal is normal, you're going to have a low cortisol to DHEA ratio, which means that DHEA is going to be produced at a relatively high level, keeping that ratio low. As an animal becomes stressed, or a human, you're going to see that initial spike in cortisol, and DHEA production is going to start to drop off, which is going to elevate that cortisol to DHEA ratio. As an animal continues to become stressed or goes into a state of chronic stress, eventually cortisol production is going to drop off, but DHEA production is going to continue to drop off as well. And the idea is that that ratio of cortisol to DHEA is going to give you a better indicator of the current status of an animal, as opposed to just looking at cortisol by itself. As I said, there's very few studies looking at animals and the cortisol to DHEA ratio, but just to point out a couple to provide you a couple of background studies. In cows, one of the studies looked at lame animals versus regular healthy animals and found a higher cortisol to DHEA ratio in the animals that were lame. Another study looking at cows showed that animals that were given access to pasture compared to animals that were housed indoors had a lower cortisol to DHEA ratio. And the final study on cows looked at transport, and they tracked cortisol to DHEA ratio over time during the transport, and they found as the transport went on, that cortisol to DHEA ratio increased. Another study looking at seals, both harbor and gray seals, and these were wild animals, found that animals with disease had a higher cortisol to DHEA ratio. So there's not a ton of evidence, but with animals, non-human animals, I should say. But there is starting to be more and more evidence. And with humans, there's quite a bit of evidence that cortisol to DHEA ratio may be a very good indicator of animal welfare, more so than just looking at cortisol by itself. So now that we've gone over some of the physiological measures we'll be looking at in these studies, the first one I wanted to highlight was a study looking at cheetahs. This study was back when I was at San Diego Zoo. We looked at 18 cheetahs over a 3-month period of time back in 2014. For this study, the animal care staff was wonderful. They collected daily fecal samples so that we could look at fecal glucocorticoid metabolites, a marker of adrenal activity. We also had some amazing volunteers that conducted 2 observations per day on every single animal, 5 days per week. And from that behavioral data, we were able to look at behavioral diversity using the Shannon H-index, and only included species-specific behaviors. So inactivity, stereotypic behavior, things like that were excluded from the analysis. What we found was an inverse relationship. So when behavioral diversity was high, or higher, fecal glucocorticoid levels were lower. And when those levels were lower, fecal glucocorticoid metabolites were higher. So this would suggest that, or provide some additional support that behavioral diversity may be a positive indicator of welfare. When animals have higher behavioral diversity, they have lower levels of adrenal activity. The second study I wanted to highlight is something that's currently under review. This study was a little bit more robust. We actually looked at 41 adult chimpanzees at 16 different zoological facilities throughout North America. The study was similar to the first one, 3 months in duration. Data were collected back in 2016. Again, amazing animal care staff at these facilities collecting daily fecal samples for us to be able to look at fecal glucocorticoid metabolites. We didn't have as much behavioral data, but we did have 30 minutes of observation per 30 minutes per observation, 3 days per week. We again looked at behavioral diversity using the Shannon index. However, for this study, we really wanted to look at how does the inclusion or exclusion of different behaviors impact the Shannon Diversity Index and its relationship to fecal glucocorticoid metabolites. And because we had a number of facilities, we did control, and both male and females, we did control for sex and institution in this study. So I'm going to walk through this just to hopefully for everyone to be able to understand kind of what we looked at. So for the relationships between fecal glucocorticoid metabolites and behavioral diversity using the Shannon's index, analysis 1 and 2, we looked at what we call positive behaviors, but these are basically things, we didn't include aggression. So species specific, only things that would be considered positive. So things like play, locomotion, feeding, those types of behaviors, similar to what we did with the cheetah study. And for analysis 1, we had the behavior split out. So for example, if we were looking at play, it would have been social play and solitary play or object play or whatever the behavior might be. And then for factor 2 or analysis 2, we had those lumped. So instead of having each individual play behavior, it was just play. For analysis 3 and 4, we included things like aggression, things that might be considered negative or might have a negative impact on the animal. And again, for analysis 3, those behaviors are split apart. For analysis 4, the behaviors were lumped together. For analysis 5 and 6, we included human interaction. So this included interacting with animal care staff as well as visitors. Again, analysis 5 was split, analysis 6 was lumped. And for the final 2 analysis, we looked at recipient behavior. So not only what the animal was doing, but what was happening to the animal. And we had a bunch of different ideas of why some of these things might be important. Obviously, from an animal care standpoint, we know human-animal interactions are very important and can have an impact on animal welfare. From a recipient standpoint, if you're being aggressed upon, obviously that could have a negative impact on your welfare. So we really wanted to look at how these different things impacted this diversity index and the relationship to a marker of adrenal activity. And overall, what we found The two that are marked in red were not significant. Everything else was significant. So what we're finding is this inverse relationship between behavioral diversity and a marker of adrenal activity. And what this might suggest is that behavioral diversity might be a pretty robust indicator of positive animal welfare. And while splitting and lumping different behaviors or including different behaviors, I'd probably recommend sticking with species-specific positive behaviors just because it seemed to be the most complete, or I don't know if complete's the right word, but the least affected by adding or removing different things. But overall, it seems to be pretty robust. And looking at the different analysis that we did, I'm feeling more and more confident that behavioral diversity can be used as a positive indicator of welfare. So the final study that I'll highlight is on bottlenose dolphins. This is also under review. Similar to the chimpanzee study, we looked at 47 bottlenose dolphins at 25 different zoological facilities, either accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums or the Alliance for Marine Parks and Aquariums. The study was 1 month in duration. Data were collected for 1 month back in 2018. We had fecal samples 3 days per week. Observations were 25 minutes in duration, 3 days per week. Again, we looked at behavioral diversity using the Shannon Diversity Index and only included species-specific behaviors, similar to what we did with the cheetah study and the first two analysis with the chimpanzees. For this study, since we included all ages, we did control for sex, age, and institution. And for this one, we actually looked at multiple physiological measures that I talked about just a couple minutes ago. And then we also looked at route tracing as a form of stereotypic behavior in dolphins and its relationship with behavioral diversity. So similar to the other two studies, we did find an inverse relationship between fecal glucocorticoid metabolites, a marker of adrenal activity, and behavioral diversity. However, we did not find a significant relationship between aldosterone and behavioral diversity. But interestingly and excitedly, we did find a relationship between the cortisol to DHEA metabolite ratio and behavioral diversity. And the relationship was actually even stronger than the relationship between just looking at glucocorticoids and their relationship. So it might suggest or provide further evidence that this cortisol to DHEA ratio may be a good indicator of animal welfare, but also provides additional support for behavioral diversity. And similar to some of the other studies that I talked about earlier, we did find a statistical relationship, an inverse relationship between route tracing, a form of stereotypic behavior in dolphins, and behavioral diversity. So getting back to the idea of behavioral restriction, if we're meeting the behavioral needs of the animals, you're likely to not see stereotypic behavior. So what does all this mean? I want to be clear, like, we don't have enough evidence at this point to say behavioral diversity is a positive indicator of animal welfare, but there is growing evidence, and the relationships that we're seeing across 3 different species that I just presented on, and specifically with the chimpanzees, looking at the multiple analyses, it does seem that behavioral diversity is fairly robust, and the cortisol to DHEA ratio does provide some additional evidence. But there is additional research that's necessary, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So, if you want to use behavioral diversity, there's a number of different things that it can be used for within a zoo or an aquarium environment. One is welfare assessments. As I said, there has been more interest, I think, in behavioral diversity and including it in welfare assessments. However, I would encourage anyone that's using behavioral diversity to always use multiple measures of welfare when assessing the welfare of an individual animal, just to make sure that you're not relying on something that may or may not be valid. One of the other things that behavioral diversity can be used for, though, is to prioritize new enrichment efforts. So all of us, especially these days with the pandemic, have extremely limited resources. And so trying to prioritize where we're going to put those resources, behavioral diversity may be a really good way to do that. And I'll share an example in just a second. And then finally, when you're making changes to an enrichment program, behavioral diversity may be a really good way to better understand how those changes are impacting those animals. So this is some data from the Brookfield Zoo. We actually looked at behavioral diversity for all of the carnivores in our collection over a 3-year period. And we collected 2 months of data studying every carnivore for 2 months during the winter, 2 months during the summer. And what this really allowed us to do was, like I said before, prioritize where our efforts were going to be. And it's not that we stopped providing enrichment for animals that had high behavioral diversity. It's just when we were revamping the enrichment program and looking for new opportunities, this was a very useful tool. So we could really take a look at which species had lower behavioral diversity and really try to brainstorm ways to increase that or improve that. And just a really helpful tool to better understand how the enrichment might be impacting animals. And then as you continually collect that information, you can see when you make those changes, how does that behavioral diversity change, theoretically impacting or improving their animal welfare. So one of the questions that I've been asked many times is, what is optimal? And unfortunately, we do not know the answer. So is there a magical number based on a species in the ethogram that you're using that you want to strive for? And I don't know what the answer is for that. All I can say is that we have always used it as a form to look at continuous improvement. So when you're changing an enrichment program or changing the husbandry of the species that you're working with, striving to continuously improve behavioral diversity, I think, is an important aspect of a management program. And so I don't know if we'll ever know what is optimal. Hopefully someday we will. And obviously we need further research. But I think in the meantime, focusing on behavioral diversity, I don't think it's going to have a negative impact on the welfare of animals in zoos and aquariums. 5 years from now, if we find out that behavioral diversity is not a valid indicator of animal welfare, I don't think it would have a negative impact on the welfare of collections. And if we do focus on behavioral diversity, there is an added bonus. Hopefully it is an indicator of animal welfare. Hopefully there'll be enough research in the near future to validate behavioral diversity. But the added benefit is that we do have research now that would suggest that by focusing on behavioral diversity, we can increase our visitors' connection to wildlife. There's research that shows that visitors to zoos and aquariums, when they have the ability to see animals engaged in a variety of different behaviors, that they have a more positive emotional connection to that animal or that species. And because of that, they want to get more involved in conservation. So not only by focusing on behavioral diversity can we potentially improve the welfare of our animals, but we can also improve or hopefully meet our mission of getting people involved in conservation. So moving forward, as I said at the beginning, absence of negative indicators of welfare does not demonstrate that animals in a positive state of welfare or like opportunities to thrive, doesn't demonstrate that an animal is thriving. We really need to validate positive indicators of welfare to not only demonstrate that our animals are in a good state, but also to better understand factors that lead to optimal welfare. There's been a couple of talks in the forum already that have talked about cognitive bias testing. And I really think it would be great to look at how does behavioral diversity relate to some of these different measures. So if you're doing cognitive bias testing, also looking at behavioral diversity, also looking at physiological measures of welfare, potentially cortisol to DHEA ratio. And again, statistically looking at stereotypic behavior and its relationship to behavioral diversity. We definitely need more research. Like I said, I wouldn't consider behavioral diversity to be validated as a positive indicator of welfare, but there is a growing body of evidence. And we also need to really start looking outside of mammals. And I've been just as guilty of it as everybody else that's been in the animal welfare field. We right now have a grant pending through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. If successful, we would actually be able to look at behavioral diversity in 25 different species, including birds and reptiles, which Field Zoo, Chicago Zoological Society have developed an application for Apple devices, so iPad, iPhone, to be able to schedule enrichment based on our most recent knowledge of the field of enrichment. And we would be implementing this application with those 25 species to be able to look at how does behavioral diversity improve while using this app, and also looking at, like I said, the relationship between behavioral diversity and these different physiological indicators of welfare. So we still have a lot of work to do, but like I said, I think there's a lot of supportive evidence that would suggest that behavioral diversity could be a positive indicator of welfare. Just want to say thank you. The 3 studies that I talked about towards the end were all funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services. So thank you for their support. Thank you to CZS, all the staff, interns, and volunteers that make this work possible. And back when I was at San Diego, thank you to their staff, interns, volunteers that made that work possible. And I will just end with the talk. I just wanted to really briefly highlight everything that's going on. We currently have an article in review. That's a review article on behavioral diversity as a potential positive indicator of welfare. There's a special issue in the journal Animals currently being published, evidence-based practice in zoo animal management. Thank you to Drs. Williams, Ward, and Carter for guest editing this special issue, but hopefully we'll be able to make, if the article is accepted, hopefully we'll be able to make it available to everyone attending the presentation today if you're interested in learning more in-depth information about behavioral diversity. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, what a brilliant presentation. Thank you so much, Lance. I've got a list of questions for you from people in the audience. So firstly, I'm going to jump to Belinda. Belinda, would you like to turn on your microphone and direct your question to Lance?
Hi, Lance. Thank you so much. That was great. I'm sorry if I sound a bit tired. It is now almost 1 AM in Australia. But I just had a question. I am a PhD student. I do work on the effects of enrichment in parrots, and I use behavioural diversity as one of my indicators, or I have been. I like it, but also have some questions about it. I just wanted to know if you were aware of a paper that was written in 2019, and it's titled a technical contribution, a cautionary note on the use of behavioural diversity. So this was published, and it has a few ideas that I really identify with just from using behavioural diversity so much and looking at other measures around behavioural diversity. And it just pretty much, in a nutshell, says that there's a lot of things that contribute to a change in behavioural diversity that have nothing to do with the behaviour of the animal itself. So like how robust your ethogram is, how when you're sampling is picking up and things like that, but also how you interpret the behavioral diversity itself. Just given that, like obviously if you have a really robust ethogram and you're only picking up on like 50% of the behaviors, the behavioral diversity is going to be lower than if you had like quite a broad category, right? Categories in your ethogram. With that particular issue, how do you see behavioral diversity being used practically, like across species within the industry itself? Like I know you can use the HMAX, so it kind of factors in the variation in ethograms between species. But if you're talking about looking at even the same species, ensuring that the behavioral diversity is actually picking up on everything, you have to make sure that every single ethogram is the same. Have you encountered any issues with this, or have any ideas to tackle this?
So first, I just want to say thank you. It's 1 a.m. there. I'm very impressed that you're here asking a question. That's wonderful. And I am familiar with the article. Katie Cronin and Steve Ross over at Lincoln Park Zoo, good colleagues. So the manuscript does bring up some really good points. The splitting and lumping, the chimpanzee study we actually started before that article came out. I am very familiar with it. Katie shared it with me. They bring up a lot of really good points, and they talk about how there's potential flaws. I like to think of it as areas of opportunity to conduct different research projects. And so I think we do need to gain a better understanding how splitting and lumping of behaviors and how the design of an ethogram impacts those scores. I think the chimpanzee study is starting to show us that it may be a little bit more robust than we think. And so one of the things that I think we need to think about is when we're splitting versus lumping, or when you're including different behaviors or not including different behaviors. So let's say you look at, what would be a good example? Play. So if you have social play and solitary play versus just play, if you split them apart, both of the percentage of time that an animal is engaged in that behavior is going to decrease. So although you're creating an additional behavior that's being observed, the percentage of time is coming down. So it's probably going to have less of an impact on the actual score by splitting and lumping than one might suggest. And so I agree that we do need to look at it more, but I don't think it's going to have as big of an impact as we might think.
Great, thanks.
Perfect. Okay, so we have another question from Juan. Would you like to turn on your microphone now and ask your question?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I was wondering if we can make comparisons between these different diversity index that are calculated, and also if you have think about using hill numbers for doing these comparisons, because like in ecology you can use these hill numbers to decide if you want to give more importance to rare behaviors or to common behavior. Well, in ecology, to common species or rare species. I guess here is common behaviors or rare behaviors.
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing. Could you please repeat that question?
Yeah. So I was wondering if you can use if you can make comparisons using this diversity index, and also if you have think about it about using hill numbers to make these comparisons, because in ecology usually you can use these hill numbers to make these comparisons, and also you can decide if you want to give importance to rare species or common species. So in this case would be like common behaviors or rare behaviors.
So if I understand the question correctly, so, and I probably didn't address this during the first question as well as I should have. So one of the concerns is comparing diversity scores across species. So if you are using different ethograms, so if you're doing a study on lions versus a study on parrots, and your ethograms are very different, it probably doesn't make sense to make that comparison between those two behavioral diversity scores. The behavioral diversity data that I shared from Brookfield Zoo, we actually used the exact same ethogram across all of our carnivores, and that allowed us to be able to compare those diversity scores. And so that's one of the things I think we really needed to think about when using behavioral diversity is, are we making those comparisons across, if we are making comparisons across species, that those ethograms are identical so that we're comparing apples to apples. But it does make it tricky if you were going to wanted to compare lions to parrots, how you would develop an ethogram that would even be meaningful. So I don't know if behavioral diversity is necessarily something that you would use to compare across different taxonomic groups, but more to better understand when you're making changes to a management program or doing a welfare assessment, where that animal's at and how that compares to that individual over time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we might just jump to Sam now. Sam, do you want to turn on your microphone?
Yeah, hi Lance.
Hey Sam, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
You should be hearing some news about that publication soon.
Wonderful.
So I've got a couple of questions, and I think you've probably touched on them a little bit already in your previous answers. I suppose initially I was kind of thinking that how have you, I suppose, defined what behaviours are classed as positive? So are you classing maintenance behaviours such as feeding and resting and locomotion, those sorts of things? Or is it just behaviours that are indicative of positive welfare? So typically we use play or, certain other things along those lines. And I suppose in my second question, although I have just now added another one to the list, it's, so does that mean that, there might be certain behaviours that will be included for some species, but then those same behaviours wouldn't be included in the diversity index for other species?
So when we use the term positive, and we probably shouldn't, because it's not necessarily play or exploration or things that you might associate with positive welfare. When I say positive, it's things that you wouldn't associate with or taking out aggression. So if an animal's being overly aggressive, it could be in a negative situation where there's something bad going on. I mean, aggression is a normal part of a lot of animals' behavioral repertoire. But when I say positive, it's just general species-specific behavior. So it doesn't necessarily have to be play or exploration, but trying to incorporate as many behaviors as possible that wouldn't have any potential negative consequences on the animal's welfare.
Okay, cool. And so I suppose then my third additional question, sorry if you don't mind me asking this, Melissa, no. Do you think it would be possible to add weightings to the index calculations that might then link in with the kind of more sort of, I suppose, more or less behaviours that are seen to be more important or less important? I've Definitely. Not indexed stuff before, so I've not worked on that line. But
I don't think we have all the answers yet. Like I said, I think there's a growing body of evidence that behavioral diversity can be used as an indicator of welfare. Having weightings, I only talked about a couple of the ways to calculate behavioral diversity during the talk, just giving an overview. But in the manuscript, we highlight all of the different ways that behavioral diversity has been calculated, and even in the future directions section, talk about potentially looking at not necessarily weighting different behaviors, but looking at how does behavioral diversity relate to the total positive total possible behavioral diversity that might be available based on the ethogram that you're using. So again, I think I'm hoping people spend time either conducting new studies or going back to historic data sets that might be appropriate to start looking at behavioral diversity. And the more studies that we can do to examine how these changes or weightings, as you asked, might impact those scores and make it more valid, I think is great if we can do that.
Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Perfect. So we'll move on to Alessia. Alessia, you've got a question for Lance. Feel free to turn on your microphone now.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Lance, for your presentation. It was very good. I have just a quick question, actually, a curiosity. How do we consider anticipatory behavior in the calculation of the Shannon index? Thank you.
Sorry, there's like a little whistling or a noise. I couldn't hear.
Okay, yeah, can you hear me now?
There's still a little whistle in the background that kind of masked it.
I'm sorry, okay.
I can potentially jump in. She's just wondering about anticipatory behavior and focus that in the index.
In the calculation of the Shannon index.
Yeah.
So anticipatory behavior, if it's repetitive in nature, I probably wouldn't include it in the index. But again, I think that's one of the things that we really need to focus on is what behaviors to include and not include. And so additional research looking at the inclusion of anticipatory behavior versus not including it and how that impacts the relationship between behavioral diversity and other indicators of welfare, whether it be physiological or cognitive bias or whatever it might be. I think those are important questions to ask.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And we've got another question. We've got a question from Paul. Paul, do you want to jump in now as well?
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Lance, for the talk. It was really nice to see the kind of application of the indices across a range of species. And one of the things that jumped out to me was, do you think that when you calculate behavioural diversity, it's a good baseline measure for what we're trying to understand in terms of species-specific activities? But kind of should it be used along the lines of what happens with husbandry change, and rather than a standalone definitive measure of animal welfare in its own right, because it's all about the context to which the animal is performing the activity?
Yeah, as I was kind of saying in the presentation, I think there's a number of different uses. As a welfare assessment tool, I wouldn't recommend using behavioral diversity by itself. As you said, it's all about context. So using multiple measures of welfare to better understand how an animal is doing in that current environment. But then also it can be used, one of the original publications back from Rob Young talked about how enrichment is about creating behavioral diversity. I mean, it's all about creating opportunities for the animals to engage in different behaviors. So using it as a tool to better understand how an enrichment program is functioning, I think can also be critical. And in the review article that I referenced that's under review, there's actually a really nice workflow that Greg and Jessica developed at San Diego Zoo that if you want to kind of think about behavioral diversity and apply a concept from an application standpoint, it really walks you through kind of the whole process to improve behavioral diversity based on the natural history of a species.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, I think I might jump in with one of my questions, and apologies.
Okay.
You covered this because I was monitoring the chat at the same time, but basically I know we've been talking about which behaviours to include and not include. I was wondering, obviously been excluded from calculations, but in terms of not necessarily natural behaviours, but potentially positive behaviours, such as animals engaging in animal training or human-animal interactions, visitor-animal interactions. Do you have any thoughts about how they might not be included in behavioural diversity, but how they can be analysed next to behavioural diversity? Or have you found that animals that are more diverse in behaviour more actively engage in those anecdotally, or have is there nothing connecting the two at this time?
So going back to the chimpanzee study, I mean, one of the things that we found is when we started including that human interaction is when we started getting some non-significant results, which might suggest that you shouldn't include those human interaction type things in the calculations. But as we know, from a lot of the work going on human-animal interaction, obviously that's very important from an animal welfare standpoint and can have huge impact. So I think one of the things that would be interesting would be to look at behavioral diversity when you have human interaction versus when you don't have human interaction, to see how that impacts those scores.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in that sort of study. Okay, well, I'm just having a look through the chat now, and I think we've gone through those questions, and we are right on time for once. So I think we might just throw back to you, Lance, for a second, if you've got any wrap-up thoughts of, that you want to leave people with in terms of behavioural diversity, those sorts of things.
Yeah, just want to say thank you again to everybody. Thank you for all the great questions. Thank you for logging in at odd hours of the evening or morning or day or whenever it is for you. I hope you found the presentation interesting. I think we still have a lot of work to do to better understand behavioral diversity and its possible application and ability to use it as an indicator of welfare. I personally don't see any harm in focusing on behavioral diversity moving forward. And I talked a little bit about the guest or visitor conservation piece as well. I just hope that over the next 3-5 years, we can really put continued efforts into better understanding behavioral diversity, and hopefully with enough research, we'll be able to use it as an indicator of welfare moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting, great area of study. As does, I'm sure, everyone here. I think everyone was really engaged throughout that presentation. That was really fantastic. So thank you so much, Lance, for your time and your expertise there. It's just given, I think it's given me so many thoughts to just incorporate in future analysis and things like that as well. So thank you so much for joining us in your presentation. It's been absolutely great. We do have another webinar planned. That one won't be for probably 3 weeks or so, but just keep an eye out on the EAZA Facebook page and the Welfare Closed Facebook page for announcements for that one as well. But other than that, it's been lovely having you all here today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be in touch about the next webinar. So thank you again, Lance, and we'll see you for hopefully all of you for webinar 6.